This afternoon you have Grant Meyer from Advanced Engineering Environmental Services. I don't know, you might want to hold your applause for a little while longer. This might not be warranted.
This is my part.
All right. Very good. I'm Grant Meyer. I'm the operations manager for our A2S office out of Maple Grove, Minnesota. Apparently, judging by the size of the crowd, the secret's out that I'm an engineer by education that does a ton of work in accounting and the financial side of our business, which I learned from the 11 o'clock speaker this morning that if accounting is fun, you're doing it wrong. So this conversation or presentation this afternoon will probably be equal parts engineering, accounting, and economics. So the only thing I've got going for me is I'm sure everybody went to bed early last night, had a nice light lunch, and then probably went out for a brisk walk. So we should be good as far as energy levels. I want to talk about capital sustainability planning, and specific to that, really how much is enough. I don't think we can really go even a couple of days in our industry without seeing some type of article about how we're not doing enough, our infrastructure's failing, we have to reinvest, things are falling apart, things are underfunded. That's all we ever hear. But really, how much is enough? If we wanted to put more in, kind of what does more mean? And we're going to go through a number of things this afternoon. First, I wouldn't be a good engineer if I didn't jam as many numbers into this presentation as I possibly could. So remember these because there's going to be a quiz in about 2 minutes. 8, 115, about 1.5 million, 313 million, and just over 15 trillion. So in the time we have this afternoon, I want to talk a little bit about why water and sewer is important. As we look at trying to generate funds for these utilities, it doesn't make any sense to do that if there's not value there. If we, as stewards of our industry, can't communicate that there's value in what we do in the water and sewer utilities, it's going to be very hard for us to justify funding. Once we get there to that point to justify funding, how much is enough? What's the right number? We're going to look at the state of our infrastructure in our country and our state a little bit, and then talk about our utility rates. And then very specifically, I'd like to review an example case study from a city right here in Minnesota that was very proactive in their approach and how we worked on things together to really determine for them how much is enough, and show you guys in a pretty simplistic way, at least in my opinion, a pretty simplistic way, about how you could look at your own individual utilities and start to build a very defendable argument for how much you should be investing based on your very specific water and wastewater infrastructure in your community, and then hopefully give you the tools to generate that type of support to move that initiative forward. So here's our numbers. Why are water and sewer important? Human can live only about 8 days without water. 115 people die every hour from poor sanitation in Africa. I don't want to pick on Africa, I want to say in not the United States of America. The level of sanitation and public health we provide is incredible, and people just take that for granted. Look at fire and safety. Fire departments put out 1.5 million residential fires last year, protecting infrastructure, protecting assets, saving lives. Population economics. Our water and wastewater infrastructure supports over 313 million people in the United States of America and a gross domestic product of over $15 trillion. I am absolutely positive that that number would crumble or we would not be able to provide the water and wastewater infrastructure that we do to the level of support we provide. Everything that we do here, and we were just talking before this started, and people take it for granted. I don't think there's anyone that doesn't think that their water and sewer rates should be lower. No matter how little you charge, if you went to the city council and said we need to raise water rates 10 cents, that's probably a terrible thing. They'll pay $100 a month for cable, they'll pay $2 a bottle at a gas station to pick up a bottle of water and not think twice about it. But when it comes time to fund what we need to do to protect our water and wastewater infrastructure, it becomes very problematic and always challenging. But how much is enough? Well, if we look at it on a nationwide level, AWWA did a study in 2012 entitled Buried No Longer, Confronting America's Water Infrastructure Challenge. And verbatim, they said restoring existing water systems as they reach the end of their useful lives and expanding them to serve a growing population will cost at least $1 trillion over the next 25 years if we were to maintain the current levels of water service. So for $1 trillion, we're not even getting better. For $1 trillion, we're providing the same level of service that we get today, which may be very good, but $1 trillion to do exactly what we're doing right now. Being an engineer, I guess thought about $1 trillion right away, but thought, there's a lot of people in America. 25 years is a long time. You break that down, we're probably talking about a couple of cents per person. I was surprised. $1 trillion over 25 years. Not that much per person, right? Well, if we look at that 313 million people in America, it's just over $3,000 a person. We have 25 years to pay for it. Still, $127 a person. Well, we pay water bills monthly. Break that down, $10 a month. Well, about 2.7 people in a house. Okay, now we're back up to just about $29 per utility bill per month to cover that $1 trillion deficit. When you look at the average current water bill in the state of Minnesota right now, it's $26.51. We're talking about doubling the water rates just to keep up. And that to generate that $1 trillion, that isn't slowly ramping up to that rate 25 years from now. That's starting to charge $28.67 more tomorrow to cover that gap. So you'd think we'd recognize that. We're all smart people and we're probably going the right direction. A2S, the company I work for, on an annual basis does the North Central Region Utility Rates Survey and collects a lot of information on what people are doing with their utility rates. If we go back here to 2008, 2009, over here in this axis, we're, I don't know, maybe around 55, 58% of utilities in the state of Minnesota were raising their water and wastewater utility rates. Some amount. I don't know what that is, but 55 to 58% of you were reporting that you were raising your water and wastewater utility rates to some extent. So, as we move forward a couple of years, a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, as the needs get bigger and there's more need to reinvest, we're down to just over 35% in 2012. Almost not quite half of the people that were raising water rates in 2008 and 2009 were following suit in 2012. As there was economic pressures, that number went down, down, down as far as the ability to fund our water and wastewater infrastructure. And I'll certainly argue that our water and wastewater infrastructure didn't get newer. It's still aging, there's still problems, there's still a need to reinvest, and we're putting less away than we were before. A couple more charts from the rate survey that it's not all doom and gloom. We look at the average cost of the water bill or average water and sewer bill in the state of Minnesota. We do see an increase in excess of the consumer price index, actually. The white line is 2.4% per year, roughly the inflationary mark over that period of time. And we look at water and wastewater rates increasing between 4.5% and 5%. What's interesting about that is we're keeping this trend going up for the state as a whole, but we just looked at only 30% of the people are actually raising their rates. So that leaves roughly 30% of the people are dragging that average up overall. So it would certainly seem that we're creating a bigger gap. The people that are raising rates, maybe being a little bit more proactive, staying in front of those things, but these communities that are maybe a little bit more stuck in that mentality that the only acceptable rate increase is zero, continue to fall further and further behind. This, for anyone out there that's a community of 5,000 people or larger, this graphic's for you. Less than 5,000 people. Numbers change a little bit, but generally speaking, the trends are very similar. So in doing some research on utility rates and what's out there and what's happening, I came across this article from the AWWA Journal. Future trends in water rates. Last one I'll read verbatim, but I think this is really interesting. The present operating costs of water utilities are the highest ever experienced in the country. Seems fair. When fixed charges have exceeded revenues, it's been necessary to raise rates. I think we could all agree with that. Management does not initiate rate increases except as a last resort. Unfortunately, I think that's very true, and sometimes not even then. If present conditions persist, however, or a substantial portion of the rising cost effects remains in effect, increases in water rates will be imperative for many utilities. Seems pretty true to me. What was interesting about this was 1948. That was 65 years ago. The AWWA Journal published an article to that effect. And I think all those issues are just as prominent today as they were, obviously, in 1948. So you'd think the federal government would be helping out with this type of thing. Well, we look at what type of money we've got through the US EPA. If we go back to 1986, 1987, they're just under $2.5 billion they put in through the revolving fund programs. But as we fast forward to present, we end up here in 2012, and it looks like they've raised that contribution to right about the same as it was in 1986. All the infrastructure that we've put in the ground, everything that's happened till then, Everything now is 25 plus years older than it was at the time, and we're right back at the same number. The support to keep up with what has to happen isn't coming from the federal government. It's coming from our local utilities. So how are local utilities set up to deal with this? Let's look at full cost recovery through rates. Again, if I would go back to the utility rates survey, this information is very specific to the state of Minnesota. It's what got returned to us. The average water revenue per account in the state of Minnesota was right at $400. For every account you had, on average in the state of Minnesota, about $400 in revenue was collected. Of that $400, about $303 of that revenue was required to pay ongoing operation and maintenance expenses. We're not building new things, we're not replacing things, we're not funding depreciation, we're just paying ongoing operation and maintenance costs. So about a $97 differential between rate revenues and our operation and maintenance expenses. That $97 is what we have left for depreciation, capital, to build things, to replace things as they fail. $97 per account. Wastewater, the gap is a little bit wider, but similar there at $405 and $269 per account. I think what we're looking at as a time, if we had any chance of keeping up with what's going on, is really changing the mentality that our behavior from very reactive to proactive. And a lot of that is our ability to generate those revenues that maybe we don't have the money to replace the pipe before it fails. The best we can do is keep pounding corks into it or fix breaks no matter how many times they happen. But that's a very reactive mentality to keeping up with this infrastructure issue. We need to move to something where we can be more proactive. We can stay ahead of this. We can generate, what I like to talk about is the opportunity to generate revenues to allow us to be proactive. I think everybody in here knows that it's far easier to do things during an 8 to 5 shift than it is to do it on a Sunday afternoon when there's a water main break. So I think everybody would prefer to be proactive, but how do we put ourselves in a financial position that we're able to do that? I promise there's only 2 slides in here that have a really strong asset management focus, but I resisted the urge to put an asset management title on this because then nobody would come, because I think they're all tired of hearing it. But what we want to do is do the right work, the right investments, the right time, for all the right reasons. And it's a very asset management type philosophy, and it's easy and fluffy to say that we want to do all that, but how do we put ourselves in a position that we can actually make those decisions and do what needs to be done? I think the key is the stakeholder support part. As I talk to the group of people here, I think everyone probably agrees that we need to do more, we need to invest more, but how do we get to a level or a position where we can do that? We need utility commissions, we need city council support, we need the educational component to get support from the constituents that are paying the bills to really support this level of investment. So how do we get to that and make people understand? Last asset management slide and then I'm done. But generally speaking, this is the theory of asset management in a really simple way. On the red line, we have a pump. Any piece of equipment you have, you put it in, it's new day one, it performs really well, you run that pump out over time, and eventually it gets down to the bottom, black line, and it fails. Somewhere along the line, it crossed that dashed black line, where you got to some minimal level of performance, where things started to maybe be more work than they were worth. Maybe you could afford to replace it at the time, maybe not. Asset management says we should try and keep things up here on this green line. Let's tip that axis a little bit and do what we can to keep our assets behaving at some line above this minimal performance level. And all that's fine if we look at the individual pieces of equipment. When we look at our utilities as a whole, we have absolutely no choice but to keep them on the green line. Falling below this minimum performance level is unacceptable. So how do we routinely reinvest in our utilities enough that we can keep kicking that thing out and keep pushing that green line out and extend longer and longer and longer and keep our utilities operating above this minimal performance level, preferably to very high performance level? So to a case study, there was a community in the state of Minnesota that we worked with they recognized this. To their credit, they were an extremely proactive community. They were at a time where, comparatively speaking, they were relatively young. Probably about 40 years, oldest pipe they had in town was about 40 years old. So in a somewhat fortunate position maybe that they weren't experiencing a lot of failures. But at the same point, when they tried to reinvest, when they tried to change their rates, to put money away for things that they knew they would need in the future, they ended up in a position where their city council said, why don't you replace anything? It's all brand new. And in a way, I suppose you can't argue with that a whole lot. You've got a lot of PVC pipe in the ground. Oldest stick in the ground is 40 years. I don't think anyone's planning on replacing a lot of 40-year-old PVC pipe anytime soon. But the community also realized that you can't just wait for it all to fail either. So they were looking for a plan to communicate the value of that infrastructure and to develop some type of annual reinvestment amount to know that they're being responsible for the future. So they wanted to shift. They were in this period of shifting from expansion. They built. Developers had paid for a lot of it, great deal for them, but developers weren't going to pay to redo it when it came time to do it again. They're approaching build-out capacity, so there wasn't a lot of new construction going on, but they knew they had to take care of what they did. And they were interested now in developing a financial framework to support that for the long term. Primary things we wanted to do is develop a capital improvement program for the utilities. We needed to support those O&M things that have to happen, but also on top of that, we wanted to look at the replacement needs and build that in. And then we wanted to prepare a 10-year revenue adequacy evaluation model to look for that. What do we need to do over 10 years? And I'm sure most of you in the room work with capital improvements plans and probably have a 5-year plan, maybe a 3-year plan for your utility, where you kind of know what those projects are going to be. There might be this water main over on 8th Street, or you really need to replace one of your high service pumps. And for those first couple of years, you've got a pretty clean picture of the things you'd like to do year after year. Maybe years 4 and 5 become more of a wish list. And I'll be the first to admit, years 5 to 10 is kind of guesswork. If your CIP even goes out that far, you have some things that may fall out there, but you also have been doing this job long enough to know that your priorities 5 years from now are probably different than your priorities are today. Things will move up or down or fail. But we wanted to prepare this 10-year plan. We didn't want to do things for the next year. We wanted to kind of change the philosophy of the city and develop something that reached much further into the future. And I'll use water as the primary example, but know that we did this for their water utility, the sewer utility, and the storm drainage utility for the city. And storm drainage is interesting that storm sewer gets almost no credit as a legitimate utility a lot of the time. But again, we wanted to make sure that as that utility that's now in its infancy starts to develop on its own and start incurring a lot of costs, that we were also providing for that. And that each of these utilities was able to stand on its own, that water could support water, that wastewater could support wastewater, and that the revenues raised in storm drainage supported those utilities. So they were able to stand on their own as unique businesses. So how do we want to do this? How to develop some type of methodology. How are we going to convey that the water system had value? And although that water system was relatively new, that it wouldn't be new forever. And how do we reinvest? Well, these are the primary steps we looked at. First was an asset inventory. What do you even have? What do we have to take care of? From there, replacement and rehabilitation costs. What if it all failed? What if it all failed tomorrow? What's the value of that utility? Useful service life. An interesting one. If you talk to a PVC pipe supplier, they'd probably tell you their pipe is going to last forever. Talk to some operator that's out in the field working on it quite a lot, he'd probably round that number down quite a bit. So how do we dial in a useful service life? Adjustment factor. This was probably the most unique item in recognizing that your assets behave differently and how do you kind of manage risk and criticality associated with those. And then we wanted to use that information. In the end, we wanted one number. We wanted to take all of this information from the city and we wanted to develop a recommended annual reinvestment. For the water utility, for instance, we didn't want to develop a whole bunch of projects. That's for the people that work in the water utility. What we wanted to do was define a number that really made sense, that we could get stakeholder support behind, so we had this capital reinvestment number kind of ingrained in them, and develop the support within the utility to raise rates as necessary or adjust rates to support that level of reinvestment. So first things first, asset inventory. What were we even trying to fund? What did they have in place? I think there's another presentation even in this room, either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, that looked entirely at GIS-based systems for asset inventory. But what do we have? The community did fortunately have a very in-depth GIS system, so we could go in there, we could query a lot of information. We could look at what all the pipes they had in the ground, what did they have, what size was it. We could group it together about how old those pipes were, condition, repair history. Was the pipe PVC? Was it ductile iron? Was it cast iron? We could look at all the different things that may have some type of impact on the likelihood of either the replacement cost or the likelihood of failure or the useful life of those different things. So first things first was a very comprehensive asset inventory. And we'll take a look at some worksheets we did in the end. This is all non-proprietary, and by non-proprietary I mean Microsoft Excel. I don't think engineers can work in anything else. So it's all open format workbook where we developed some systems here that we'll look at. So it's definitely not overly complicated. So once we've identified the assets, what did we have? What were we trying to protect and refund? Now that we know what it is, what does it cost to replace it or rehabilitate it? And what will it cost? Obviously, you're not going to tear up the whole city and reconstruct it in a day, but we had to look at it with that type of mentality. We had to establish what is the worth of those assets. And part of that's local experience, part of that's regional references. You've got 10 miles of 12-inch PVC water main that's about 7.5 feet of cover. Start to identify what would it cost if you had to replace that. One of the other things we're very conscious of looking at was replacement versus rehabilitation, knowing that maybe there's an 8-inch sanitary sewer pipe in the ground that they're not going to reconstruct, they're not going to dig up the street again and replace that 8-inch sanitary sewer when the time is right. They'll probably use new construction methods, and maybe they'll slip line that pipe, and there may be different costs associated with that than new construction. So we wanted to be very realistic, too, when we went in there to rehab that, what would those costs be? Useful service life. How long are things going to last? We're fortunate that a lot of our infrastructure does last a very long time, but this was one of those things, again, that came down to local experience. What have they seen within their own communities? And this will be unique for each of your communities, too. One of the things that jumps out at me is there's areas of very hot soil, and they knew that even though that some of their ductile iron, cast iron pipes weren't very old, they were very susceptible to corrosion because of the unique conditions within their systems out there. There's industry standards, there's professional judgment, there's regional comparisons. We could talk to pipe suppliers, and they would identify different things. We could talk to neighboring communities maybe that were built in similar times and what some of their experiences were. So we tried to draw as much information as we could into this, knowing that and you can tell as we're building this, every step of the line it's a lot of assumptions that are going into how we're putting this together. One of the most interesting things I think got into what we just collectively kind of called an adjustment factor. But it would be very easy to take, here's what we have, here's how much it costs to replace it, and here's its useful life. Pretty simple math to know how much you should be reinvesting every year to replace that very specific piece of equipment. Just by dividing its price out by its useful life, you should be good. Knowing that assets don't necessarily behave that way, and recognizing that some assets may have a lot more value than others, we looked at adjustment factors. And to sum a lot of things up pretty quickly, I think this graph does a good job of showing probability of failure versus consequence of failure. Let's take, if you have a redundant fluoride feed pump in your water treatment facility. It's a mechanical piece of equipment, so probability of failure may be somewhere in the middle. But if it's one redundant feed pump, the consequence of failure, if that went out, probably not that big a deal. So you're back here on this lower one, you've got another pump to back it up, you're good to go. If you take your primary high service pump for your utility, or maybe a primary well that doesn't have very good backup or firm capacity, now some of those things get very critical. If the probability it's going to fail increases, maybe it's old, maybe it's mechanical, maybe you've had so many problems with that particular well over its history that you just have no confidence in its ability to continue to perform, there's a lot of things that could drag that probability of failure up pretty high. Compare that to the consequence of failure. If it's also that major well that you really rely on to support the needs of your community, those things go way up here. Its probability of failure is pretty high. The consequence of failure is pretty high. Those get to be things that deserve a lot of attention. And when we looked at what we wanted to reinvest, those things got a higher priority, or we'll say a higher percentage of their cost made it into that reinvestment amount, making sure that we would have adequate funds to support these things that were the most critical. Maybe that's a lift station. When those things back up, bad day. So I stood at the back of the room and put this up earlier. I think you can read most of it. The numbers themselves probably aren't particularly valuable, but what I wanted to demonstrate, there's pages and pages of this worksheet that went into developing the tool. But again, pretty simple Excel format where we looked at what were our assets over here. And these are horizontal assets, to go back to an asset management phrase. Horizontal assets, pretty much pipes, things that are buried in the ground. So wanted to look at what we have, ductile iron pipe between 30 and 40 years old. Sizes of that pipe, looks like we had about 2,288 feet of 3-inch ductile iron pipe. Whether I'm not right or not on the cost, we can argue about, but maybe that takes $32 a foot to replace. Gives us kind of a total replacement value for that piece of infrastructure. Take that infrastructure over, maybe a likely 100-year life for ductile iron pipe in that particular area. Divide that out. We should be reinvesting 32 cents per linear foot per year for that specific asset. And we can take that down through pages and pages and look at every pipe size and every pipe type and kind of go through a similar exercise there. We see 30 to 40-year-old pipe, here's 20 to 30-year-old pipe. Tried to chunk that together so we could kind of follow these assets as they got older. Moving over here, the adjustment factor. I'm not sure if these were actual numbers or dummy ones I put in here, but what we wanted to do is recognize, for 30 or 40-year-old pipe at 0.8%, or 0.8 value, maybe we're not reinvesting everything because it's not 100 years old yet. The actual likelihood of failure of that 30 to 40-year-old pipe probably isn't that high. But the likelihood of failure of this 30 to 40-year-old pipe is probably comparatively higher than the 20 to 30-year-old pipe. So we try to use that type of mentality to know, almost recognizing that City Council's argument earlier that our system is very new. We don't need to replace the whole thing tomorrow. That's true. When this is 30 or 40 years old, you don't need to put in 100% of that. We can kind of ratchet things up over time, but we do need to be reinvesting something. So one more level of math to take into account that adjustment factor, and now we've developed an adjusted annual reinvestment cost for that particular piece of infrastructure. So again, imagine pages of this going down as we look at all the horizontal assets for the city. Similarly, but a little bit more involved, maybe was our vertical assets. Now we're getting into buildings, a water treatment plant, a well, a pump station, a lift station. Similar exercises there. I apologize that this is a little bit harder to read in the back of the room. What we're looking at here, though, is essentially a cost estimate for major well rehabilitation. We looked at the pieces of the well, again, what type of assets they had, costs of that, multipliers, and useful lives. This looks like we put about a 30-year life on major well rehabilitation. Unfortunate that this one uses something where useful life is all similar. I know for the water treatment facility, for instance, we assign very different useful lives to the structural components of the facility versus the mechanical components of the facility to try and recognize that that's not all going to fail or reach the end of its useful life at the same time. So we've gone through these exercises. Now if we roll it all up, take those pages and pages of worksheets, roll things up together, here's what's the water sheet kind of looked at cumulatively. We looked at their water distribution system, how many feet they had, reinvestments, all to get to this adjusted annual reinvestment cost. And for this particular community, I said we wanted to get all the way down to one number. We wanted to take all this information, boil it all down to one thing. That was the number. $1,714,000 per year was the recommended reinvestment for this community. I'm not sure what they're going to spend it on. I don't know exactly what projects that's going to be. I don't know if they're replacing wells or pumps or water main in a particular part of town. But we could say with some level of defendability based on their very specific system that if they wanted to be keeping pace, they should be looking to reinvest about $1.7 million in their water utility each year. Another thing I don't know if I do a good job of demonstrating a little bit later on is this 1.7 in addition to being a bunch of other things, it is also very much an average. It's based on the system as a whole, a very cumulative look at things. I'm not suggesting that they go make up projects to spend $1.7 million in a year. What I'm suggesting is they develop a financial framework within their utility to support that level of investment if they need it. If they're only going to spend $1 million in a year because that's what they have, super. Do the $1 million a year on projects you have, but have a framework where you can take that $700,000 and tuck that away in a capital replacement fund and some type of fund in the water utility, knowing that maybe 2 years from now you're going to have a $3 million bill. And you'll put away $700,000, maybe extra, the last couple of years to be able to fund that. So definitely an annual average, and wanted to develop the financial structure to support that within the city. So what did that look like? A couple things here, a lot going on in this graph, but this was our 10-year model that we wanted to develop for them as far as rates. We noticed in the first couple of years things weren't super rosy down here. This blue line was just what they wanted for an operating reserve. We're not putting an extra dollar away for capital. I believe all they wanted at this point was to have about 90 days of operating and maintenance expense on hand in a fund for a rainy day. Not in great condition there early on, so it took us some work even to get back to the point by 2015 where we could even fully fund the operating reserve. And to get there wasn't easy. You know, it probably wasn't a nickel. If we look at comparing now this right axis of the graph to the rate adjustments, it looks like 2011, 12, 13, and 14, they're all looking at rate increases in the range of maybe 5.5% to 7%. So definitely real money if it's 5 and then 6 and then 7 and then 7 and those things compounded. But it gets us into a position here in year 5 where those rate increases drop back down to something that we'll call acceptable inflationary numbers. When we're in this range of 2.5% to 3%, and we look at what starts happening to some of those account balances. We got to the point where they could fund that operating and maintenance reserve. So now they've got a little bit more comfort there as far as paying the bills. Now you see this pink line that's all shaded, and we shaded this intentionally, recognizing that 5 to 10 year part of your capital improvements plan, once you get out that far, it is pretty fuzzy. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. A lot of things can change. But if we project this model out, we got to where we needed to be, and then here in these pink lines, there's where we start to grow that capital sustainability fund. That amount where we're starting to put money away that we don't really know what we're going to use it for yet, but we know that utility is getting older and we're going to need to reinvest. And what was very important for city staff is this particular utility, and probably how they got into this shape. They had money put away once upon a time, and they had that money put away, and then the general fund saw that money and said, that's awesome, we need some money and you have some. So they took it. So what they wanted to do, what they're very clear about doing, was earmarking this and having a very specific reason why they didn't want to, just build this up to an $8 million cash reserve. Awesome, if they can. But they wanted to make absolutely certain that every dollar in there had a very strong defense behind it to make sure the money didn't get pillaged again in the future. Move through wastewater, the sewer system a little bit quicker because the theory is all the same, but we did very much the same thing for their sanitary sewer utility. We looked at the force main they had in place, looked at the gravity mains, and then the lift stations. Same type of mentality, went into what do they have, what would it cost to replace it. There were some interesting things when we looked at the sewer system because there was places where that sewer might be 25 feet deep or more, so you had to look at that as part of the replacement costs, factor some of those things in. But we got down, then again, boiling it down to a single number. In the end, the number for the sanitary sewer utility was about $673,000. Again, I don't know what exactly that we're going to spend $673,000 on, but it was a defendable amount for them to be looking at reinvesting over the long term for the utility. Very similar situation for the wastewater utility, looking at some pretty aggressive rate increases in the early years, but hopefully putting them in a position where they could bring things down to a very manageable number and then be able to start establishing some of those balances year after year. In the near term, in the context of capital improvements planning, we talked a little bit early on how a lot of you are very involved in capital improvements planning in kind of years 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 5, and identified a lot of projects. what we did in these first years, back here where we knew what those projects were, if we took that $673,000 number, we just simply took off the capital improvements projects that we knew we were going to do. If they already had $500,000 in the books, well, that's $500,000 that they did reinvest in capital, which left us about $173,000 that maybe we wanted to kind of fund above and beyond and start to try and develop some of this cushion for out years and be able to be proactive then in the things we did. A few things about that annual reinvestment amount. That was clearly for asset replacement and rehabilitation. There was no operation and maintenance in there. We looked at depreciation, a very accounting-based look at depreciation as we kind of looked at that annual reinvestment amount, made sure that those things made sense. But this wasn't O&M. This is purely capital when we identified that amount. Definitely a recommended annual amount. There was no specific projects identified, left that to utility to find out exactly how they were going to spend the money. What we wanted to do was make sure that we were putting them in a position to have the funds available to do what they wanted to do. And then beyond that, really, it's a guideline to support long-term planning. This wasn't, I know the number's not right for 2013 or 15 or 18 or even 20, but it's very defendable that it's probably a good average of the right number as you look out over long-term planning. It's not a replacement for the annual CIP. I don't want them to throw out the projects they know they need to do and just say, well, if we throw $673,000 of projects, we'll be good next year. Certainly don't want to do that. We want to be very methodical and continue to do the projects that need to be done when they need to be done. But we want to make sure that we've got the funds available to do that and don't end up pounding more corks in or wrapping duct tape around more things because we just don't have the funds to support what needs to be done. What this was by far the most successful at was really building support for this whole initiative. We didn't have to sell it to city staff. We met with city staff a lot in internal meetings, went over for a lot of one-hour meetings that turned into 3.5-hour philosophical discussions about different things. But those weren't the people that needed to be sold. They were on board completely with funding their utility and generating that level of revenue. From there, though, we went on to meet with the Conservation Committee, who was very concerned about raising rates and how those rates would affect conservation and were we doing the right things for the utilities from a conservation side of things. Budget Advisory Committee, definitely clearing house for the city is when we started talking about not only raising rates, but starting to generate some of those earmarked funds. When we looked at generating capital sustainability to the point where there might be $4 million sitting in an account in the water utility, and making sure that there was an understanding and appreciation that that $4 million wasn't arbitrary, but it was for a very specific thought process in the utility. And what we got to was absolutely unanimous support from the City Council in a meeting that we thought would be one of the more contentious ones, and them all saying, yeah, a lot of good work, but we're not doing that. They got to a point where unanimous support from City Council, and they blessed not only the instantaneous rate increases for the following year, but kind of almost ahead of the game or sort of blessed the proposed rate increases for the next 5 years. Not that they were going to set it in stone, but they definitely documented that they approved of that process and the direction it was headed. So they were successful in generating the support they needed to get that done. So, kind of in closing here, what can we do? I think really we need to recognize that utility rates will continue to increase. There's no way around that. For some reason, we're stuck kind of as a society in a place where we place very little value on water. People absolutely expect clean water to come out of their tap. They expect it to go down the drain and not back up into their basement, and they think that that's a basic human right that has little value, and we have to get over that. They're going to continue to increase. Rates go up, insurance goes up, transportation goes up, cost of chemicals and electricity, all of the things that take to do our job to run these water and wastewater utilities will continue to increase, and water rates are going to be part of that. I do think as stewards of the industry, capital sustainability, responsible utility management, we can call it asset management, we can call it whatever we want. I focused almost entirely on generating revenues today, but I could have a lot more conversations about doing the right things with the revenue we generate. How are we spending that money the right way? Are we being efficient in the right places? A guy this morning talked about VFDs and its ability to cut costs out of utilities by using them in different ways. A lot of things we can do fall under that second bullet to make us more efficient with the dollars we have. Promoting public education. There is value to what we do for people to see that. One of the guys before we got started mentioned that they, in their utility, had calculated the value of a 20-ounce bottle of Dasani water at $2 for that, the cost being well over $1,000 or $1,000 per 1,000 gallons, if I remember right. So there's public education and the value of what we provide and what we do. And then selling that value of water, that it has value, and to get that out in the public so they start to understand that. So when we see generating revenue to support that, that they're on board. Because city council will be on board if they get less phone calls of people complaining. And insisting on full cost pricing. It's all part of that. When we looked at closing that gap, when we said we made $400 per account and $303 of that was going to operation and maintenance, that only leaves us $97. Is it enough? Probably not. So how do we get to the point where our water, sewer, stormwater utilities aren't relying on funds from outside sources? We looked at the money the federal government was kicking back into the program, and it's not much more than it was almost 30 years ago. It's going to come back to the individual utilities and how we put ourselves in a position to support that. In closing, I think this is actually either the opening statement or the closing statement to that AWWA study confronting America's problem with buried infrastructure. When you consider everything that tap water delivers, public health, fire protection, support for the economy, the quality of life we enjoy, all of those things we covered in those first couple of slides, we owe it to future generations to confront the infrastructure challenge today. It's not going to go away. If we don't start investing that money today, that $1 trillion number isn't going to magically go away in 25 years. So in this room, I feel a lot like I'm preaching to the choir, that everybody knows that we need more money and we need to be proactive, not reactive. But to what we can do to help put people in a financial position to be able to do that is important. So thank you for the opportunity to talk for a little bit, and I'm happy to answer any questions about either the case study I talked about or the topics in general. Yes?
What was the approximate population of that?
Just under 70,000 people. So it was a bigger metropolitan area community. Yes, Lynn?
Could you go back to the two charts on the rate increase and then you start to build some funds?
Oh, these?
Yes, I want to know the beginning of the curve, each line, center.
The beginning.
Is that the blue line that shows that initially you had the rate increase much more,
Excuse me.
a sharp increase from 2010 to 2011?
We'll say there was a 0% rate increase in 2010. So what we were looking at then in the dashed black line is on January 1st of 2011, for instance, the utility increased rates just around, looks like right around 6%. And then in 2012, they're looking at about a 6.5% rate increase on top of that. 2013, 6.5, 7, maybe 7.5, and then dropping down into 2015 again, and now settling into a place where they were at about a 3% rate increase per year, kind of an annual rate indexing type mentality. So aggressive in the first 5 years to kind of put them in a position where now a compounding 3% rate increase is where they needed to be to grow those funds and be able to maintain this 90-day operating and maintenance reserve and start to work those kind of shaded pink boxes up to this target.
And I'll say that if you have that capital reserve, then do you reinvest in stock market or something? So maybe your rate of return is much higher than the rate that you are.
It absolutely could be how the city chooses to manage. They could do a lot of things like that. I'm not sure how the city will manage this money if they get to the point where they actually have a $4 million investment. Certainly would encourage them to do something more than just sit on that, but with how they use that within the utility, or as long as we were just most concerned that they didn't give it away or that somebody else didn't take it. But yeah, we didn't take into account anything more than I think a very basic investment interest rate of maybe 0.5%, maybe I think. So, anything else? Yes?
Those adjustment factors ever calibrated or recalibrated, or you gonna go back and look at those and see how you came up with those?
I absolutely think those should be recalibrated, and for a couple of reasons. Not only learning more as you go, but as we looked at, I won't scroll back there, but we did group sections of pipe into age. And the fact that there was a certain amount of pipe that was 30 to 40 years old and that had a certain value, part of that value was based on the fact that that's 30 to 40 years old. You know, if we go 5 years, 10 years into the future, that same section of pipe is now going to be 40 to 50 years old. And I think we need to adjust, even if that adjustment factor was correct for 30 to 40-year-old pipe, it would make sense that 40 to 50-year-old pipe should be a little bit higher. So as the system starts to age, that recommended reinvestment amount on the water side of about 1.7 million probably gets a little bit higher as that utility gets a little bit older and things start to approach the end of those useful lives. Yes?
See, a study like this, it should be, this could possibly a tool for a utility to maintain that money in its account, because I think that, you know, as a utility builds money like that, there's other sections of government that might, you know, look at that money and want to shift that around for purposes.
Absolutely, and that is exactly what happened to this utility a number of years back, which put them in that pretty tight spot early on, and they were very diligent about communicating what it was, documenting those numbers, those annual reinvestment numbers, and to the greatest extent that they could, communicating to the Budget Advisory Committee, to the City Council, embedding kind of that concept into policies. So everyone thinks it's a great idea now. Unanimous support, people were on board. We couldn't have been happier with the result we got. But 5 years from now, City Council will be different. Economic environment will be different. People's memories get short maybe when there's money there that they want to get their hands on. So will it be the war chest the water utility wants it to be? I certainly hope so. You know, is there risk that someone else sees that and pulls it away? You know, I guess there's always that risk. But the city's tried to document it as much as they can in sort of an informal city policy, what that money is, how it got developed. And that's why they went through the extent that they did, or why I think the tool was valuable in the way it was, and that they didn't say, well, you know, we just need to put away $1 million. You know, then it's all a little bit more arbitrary, and it would be easier for someone to come back and argue that, well, you only spent $500,000 last year, you don't really need $1 million. You know, by going through an exercise that used their specific utility and their specific assets and the age of those assets, I think went a long way to being very defendable and helping defend, you know, that money and why it's there. Yes,
We
front.
look at that basically if you've got a fairly new water utility and you borrowed all the initial capital to build that utility, so the water rate you're charging your current customers is repaying. They're already paying for that structure. And at some point they'll have it paid off. It may be wore out, but then at that point you've got new use. I mean, you're kind of double charging. You want them to put away money. They're buying the structure, paying for it, but then you want them to put money away to, when they've used it up and paid for it already, you want them to pay to put another one in for the next. Yeah, it gets to be kind of a catch-22.
That gets to be a great point, and what made this, and we should all be so fortunate as this utilities. They had no debt. Obviously, they didn't have a lot. You know, they didn't have a lot going for them in the way of cash balances here either. But they didn't have debt, so they weren't double dipping, so to speak, at that point. You know, things had been. If a community was in a position where it had, you know, a fair amount of debt service, I would probably propose that maybe you go through the same exercise, and maybe you identify that $1.7 million a year is also the right number for your utility, but you've got a debt service of $1 million a year. Well, I think you could argue pretty strongly that $1 million you're paying in debt service was sort of the money you put away for capital. So, you know, there comes a time where you're going to have to pay off that capital before then you can turn around, and maybe your rate structure doesn't change because you're still trying to fund $1.7 million a year, but in that first 20 years, loan or whatever, $1 million of that is going down to pay down assets you bought. Then in year 21, rolls over, and now that $1 million starts to fund replacement of that. So, you know, to kind of keep things rolling that way. I still think the tool would work, but we would probably build a little bit differently if there would have been a debt service component to that we wanted to fund as part of that. Pull the debt service maybe out of the operating and maintenance expense, even though it is an ongoing expense, but recognize that that was very specific to capital development and handle it that way. Does that answer your question, kind of? I think there was a question in the back.
Yeah, I'm kind of new to this, but if a utility charges money to use it based on the fact that they're going to use it to replace assets, and it's used for something else, isn't that illegal?
Somebody probably has a better answer than I do.
Well,
I've seen it done. I would think so, yes.
My point would be is that before I do that, before I'd agree to that, I would have lawyers writing that up to lock that money up.
Yeah.
I don't want it to go for a new park.
Right.
And then the water mains breaking out in front of my house.
Yeah, and I think that would be very utility specific. And in my experience, most utilities have relatively strict ordinance for this green bond, this water. Some people call it water availability charge. Some people call it water access charge. Most utilities have very strict ordinances on how that money can and can't be spent. I would think it would be well within a city's ability to have legal counsel help them develop a similar ordinance that provides similar protection and framework for money in some type of capital sustainability fund.
Problem, you've got the council that adopts that ordinance has the same power to take that ordinance away.
They absolutely do.
That's the key right there.
They do.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right, thanks everybody. I only saw a few sleepy heads. That was good.